Greetings and welcome to this Concord Museum Forum. I'm Tom Putnam, the museum's Edward W. Kane Executive Director, and I want to thank all of you for watching this program and express my appreciation to our three co-sponsors, Mass Humanities, the Robbins House, and the Royal House and Slave Quarters. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the Royal House and Slave Quarters Executive Director, Kiara Singleton, who will introduce tonight's forum.
Thank you, Tom. So I have the absolute honor and privilege to introduce one of the most renowned and prolific historians of African American and Native American history today. And you don't have to take my word for it, as she is the recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. Born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, Dr. Miles holds an AB in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University, an MA in Women's Studies from Emory University, and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Currently, Dr. Miles is a professor of history and the Radcliffe Alumna Professor at Harvard. She is also the director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. Now, I am not kidding when I say Dr. Miles is prolific. She is the author of 6 books. Her first book, Ties That Bind, won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians and the Laura Romero Prize from the American Studies Association. The House on Diamond Hill won the National Council on Public History and the American Society for Ethnohistory Book Prizes. Her novel, Yes, a Novel, The Cherokee Rose, was a Lambda Literary Award finalist. Tales from the Haunted South is a published lecture series, and The Dawn of Detroit won the Merle Curti Award in Social History, the James A. Rowley Prize in the History of Race Relations from the Organization of American Historians, the James Bradford Best Biography Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award in Nonfiction, an American Book Award, and a Frederick Douglass Prize. And the book we are all here to learn about is her latest, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, which has received an outpouring of praise. Some of that praise I'm gonna focus on comes from Jill Lepore, and she states on the back of the book, "In All That She Carried, the peerless Tiya Miles confronts both the staggering anguish and atrocity of American slavery and the still more staggering courage and beauty of the lives she chronicles, a history told with brilliance and tenderness and fearlessness." As one of Tiya's students, I can attest to the tenderness and rigor in which she approaches history. When I first set off to do archival research, Tiya told me that she was more interested in what I could do with 5 documents than what I could do with 500. At the time, I didn't quite understand that Tiya was preparing me to confront the reality that the stories of the very people who were compelled to labor to build the wealth of this nation would be left out of the archives. But we must tell their stories anyway. Her words reminds me that the work of a great historian and storyteller is to acknowledge that limitation and then to think creatively and expansively about how we can ask new questions and utilize new sources to not only imagine, but also to paint a portrait of Black women's lives. In All That She Carried, Tiya turns to objects and art when the archive falls short to capture the fullness of Rose, Ashley's, and Ruth's lives. What is more important, what is more tender than the devotion to our ancestors' lives and histories? Tiya's devotion to wrestling stories from the margin has redefined the fields of history, Native American studies, Black studies, and women's studies, and has given all of us the courage and a map to be bolder and more defiant in the stories we tell. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tiya Miles.
Kiara Singleton, that was so moving, so generous, so wonderful. Thank you. I mean, I am thrilled that we are gathered here and that there are people with us in the virtual space, but honestly, I could go to bed right now happy with what it is that you just said. What a pleasure it is to be a teacher and to have you among my students, Kiara. Well, it's really gratifying to be here, and I'm grateful to Tom Putnam and the Concord Museum for inviting me and for bringing together additional partners in the museum world to host this event. I think it's so important that we have the Robbins House here and the Royal House and Slave Quarters here, because museums are critical to the interpretation of the rich and complex history of this country for the public. Museums are often the homes and the caretakers of the very kinds of artifacts that I'll be talking about tonight. I really couldn't be happier, couldn't be luckier than to come before you under the auspices of these three museums. I am actually away from my home right now. I am on Nantucket Island, where I have been doing research on another museum, the Museum of African American History, which is centered on incredible historic sites that were built by the Black community here, going back to the 18th century and the 19th century. And so again, I'm so grateful for the work that the museum administrators and curators, interpreters, and visitors do. So I have about 15 or 20 minutes at the start of our time this evening to offer an overview and a framework for what will mostly be a dialogue. And I thought that I would begin with the place where I started All That She Carried, and that is a sack. So I'm now going to share my screen. And in a moment, I will show it to you. This is the sack. And this is where I started when I was inspired to work on the book that became All That She Carried. This sack, tote, carry-all, bag has had a surprisingly eventful and impactful life, although it looks on the surface to be quite plain. The sack is known as Ashley's sack, and it was given that name by two curators who did the first research that we know of on the sack, and who describes it in the following way in the very first description of it. Charleston, South Carolina, circa 1850, 1921, needlework. Plain weave cotton ground, cotton lock stitch fabrication, 3-strand cotton embroidery floss, back stitch embroidery. Height, 29 feet, 11 by 16, and width, 15 3/4 inches. Sacks made of plain weave cotton, like this example, were manufactured for flour, seeds, and other food staples beginning in the late 1840s with the invention of the industrial sewing machine. Unlike stitching by hand, double locking chain stitch produced by the machine made a seam strong enough to hold heavy contents. The numerous worn spots had been reinforced with rectangles of cloth carefully hand sewn in place. And that research there was the work of Mary Edna Sullivan, a curator at Middleton Place, as well as her partner there. Mary Edna Sullivan is the person who attached the name Ashley Sack to this artifact. So until this past March, Ashley Sack was on display at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Currently, it is at the Middleton Place Plantation, which is a National Historic Landmark and a former rice estate that was owned by one of Charleston's wealthiest families, the Middletons. Middleton Place Plantation is owned and operated by Middleton Place Foundation, which is the owner of the sack and which loaned the sack to the Smithsonian. Soon, the sack will be exhibited at the new Charleston International African American Museum. This sack has taken so many twists and so many turns along its journey to these various sites in our country. One of the pivotal moments of the sack's history took place when a flea market shopper, just like you or just like me, was looking through bins in Tennessee and was combing through rags and came across this sack, which looked like a rag, which was being sold as a unit with other rags for the price of around $20. She bought it and later discovered that it was not at all what it seemed. Because in fact, even more compelling than the twists and turns that this object has taken are the many stories that it can open up for us about enslaved Black women's lives, about women's textile and craft work, about Black families, about heirlooms and inheritances writ large, about love, and about resilience. Mothers and daughters often pass down heirlooms. They pass down items that are treasured and saved from previous generations that bring to mind lost loved ones. This is a common family practice, and it's one that I have been fortunate enough to engage in as well. I have a number of items that were given to me by my mother, that had been owned by my grandmother, and by my great aunt. Many of us, I think, hold dear quilts, recipes, books, photographs, articles of clothing that we received from our parents, grandparents, and our foremothers. Ashley's sack is in keeping with that tradition, but it also stands apart from it. And it's that difference from something that we feel is very familiar, that arrests our attention, that draws our focus, that enables us to see the wealth in this simple cotton sack. Because in this case, in the case of Ashley's sack, a woman named Rose, a Black mother with little control over her own life and no financial assets, passed down an object of invaluable worth. Rose was unfree. She was an enslaved woman held in bondage in Charleston in the 1850s. And she was about to have her child stolen from her. In that moment of grave threat that we can scarcely imagine, Rose grabbed a sack. She grabbed the sack that we were talking about tonight, the thing now known as Ashley's sack, and she started to pack it with a variety of items. The sack wouldn't be for Rose, as the name suggests. Instead, it would be for the child who would soon be lost, that 9-year-old little girl named Ashley. When Rose learned that Ashley was to be sold away from her, she thought on her feet with creativity and with foresight, and she made what may have been a sudden judgment call. She could have asked herself in that moment, what is required to keep one small girl alive as she goes into a dark and unknown future? Rose's answer to that question may be evident in the things that she packed into the sack that day. A dress, a braid, pecans, and a mother's love. Today, none of these items still exist within the sack, except for Rose's love. So in all that she carried, I try to think about and open up a discussion about the sack itself and the things in the sack as a means for us to travel into the past, in a sense, to get a glimpse into the interior lives of enslaved Black women to the extent that we can, and to think about the larger stories of Black women's history, Black family histories, material culture histories, and even larger stories of emergency, of what can be done, what must be done when it feels like the world is collapsing in on a person, on a family, on a community, on a nation. And so I think about the dress as a way that Rose could have kept Ashley clothed, even once Ashley was separated from her, as a shield that could protect Ashley from the roving eyes of slave traders, slave dealers, and the new people who would enslave her. The dress might also have been an aid for Ashley in disguise and in escape. As the historian Laura Edwards shows, enslaved people tended to use new clothing for it. The braid could function almost like a photograph, like a memento, like a visual and tactile representation of Rose the mother herself. And because hair holds our DNA, that braid could also have symbolized a long family lineage for Ashley. Pecans, I discovered through research and reading the work of food historians, was actually not an easy kind of food for Rose to get her hands on. Currently, we associate pecans with the Southeast, which is where Rose and Ashley were located down in South Carolina. But the pecan is actually a native tree a little bit further westward around the Mississippi River area, going up into Illinois, going into the Southwest, into Texas and Mexico. So pecans were a luxury good when Rose acquired them for Ashley. And it turns out pecans are also incredibly nutritious. And so Ashley could have used these nuts to stave off hunger and also perhaps to trade for other things. And love was the biggest and boldest thing that Rose packed for Ashley that day. The love that Rose gave could soothe Ashley in her suffering. And it could remind her that she was worthy by insisting that she was beloved and never truly without her kin. So Rose gave Ashley this sack packed with the items that I just listed on the eve of their separation. Ashley passed it down to her granddaughter, Ruth Middleton. And Ruth, a free woman who migrated north to Philadelphia during the first wave of the Great Migration, embroidered the sack with the story that I have just told you, saving it for history and sealing with thread a Black mother's eternal love. Ruth's embroidery reads, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her, it'd be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother. Ruth Middleton, 1921. This embroidered story of forced separation and loss is common in the history of American slavery. It's common in the experience of Black life. And yet, it is breathtakingly particular to this mother and to this daughter. And I think it is in that specificity of their intimate story that the terror of the whole, the terror of the fact that this was common, sinks in to our awareness, sinks in to our understanding. Rose's packing of the sack or gifting of the sack to Ashley and Ruth's embroidery of the story remind us that despite that terror, despite that atrocity, Black women did survive. Black people did survive captivity. And the evidence of the sack also gives us a sense, a hint of how it is that they were able to survive. We can see through the sack story that Black women seem to have identified the physical and emotional things that their loved ones would need. And that Black women attempted to generously provide those essential things to the best of their ability. Those things included many items that are among the hierarchy of human needs: food and clothing, and also shelter. I know that may seem like a bit of a stretch, but remember the size of the sack was actually quite long and pretty wide, and perhaps large enough for a 9-year-old girl to crawl into, to hold over her head as a weather shelter, to place over her body as a blanket. So food, clothing, shelter, identity through lineage, and most centrally, an affirmation of worth and belonging to a community, belonging to a family, belonging to a group. This bag was no ordinary object, but instead a prescription for survival and evidence of emergency planning in the face of disaster. In the material culture of African America, it is one of a kind. And in the current moment of national crisis, it can perhaps be a model and an inspiration. Rose's hope for her daughter's perseverance was realized. Her vision for Ashley alive came to pass. Ashley persisted, as did her daughter Rosa, and her daughter Ruth, and hers, Dorothy. And so the book, All That She Carried, follows the odyssey set in motion by a single Black woman, Rose, whose ideals and seemingly modest act, as recalled by her descendant in the form of story and needle art, shaped a family's perseverance against the odds. The book offers a cautionary tale about the personal pain and the collective price that is paid when a society devalues what is precious. In this case, a single girl, a beautiful life. This book is a story of trauma and transcendence, rooted in the archive of written records, and also in the intimacies of the heart, which we can grasp for and reach toward through artifacts like this sack. The book bears meanings about the burdens of being human in an inhumane world, and about the treasures, traumas, and capacities that we all inherit and carry. Thank you.
Professor Miles, thank you so much for both that moving presentation and really for this wonderful book, which I cannot recommend highly enough to our viewers. And it's so richly textured, and despite our combined efforts tonight, we won't do it justice. So I really encourage our readers or our viewers to get the book. And before we start, similar to how you ended it, I feel first I'm honored to be here with you this evening, but some hesitation because it really feels like a sacred item. You write in the book that Rose sealed those items, rendering them sacred with the force of emotional promise, a mother's enduring love. And I suppose what's so deeply poignant is, again, that moment of unspeakable grief when it was passed from Rose to Ashley. But I just wondered if you comment on that and what it's been like to work these past years with this artifact and the emotions that it evoked in you.
Yes. It's such an important question. It really goes to the center of the process that I experienced in working on this book, and that many of us who work on traumatic topics, who work on histories of enslavement and abuse experience. So first, to the word sacred, which you picked up on in the book. I did not use this word lightly, because as an academic, as a scholar, we have been trained to understand the lines of distinction between different kinds of methods and between different ways of knowing and understanding any piece of evidence that might be put before us. I am not a historian of religion. I am not a theologian. And the realm of the sacred is not what I study and not what I am best trained to try to understand. Historians and scholars of the American past and other nations' past tend to try to separate themselves from questions of spirit and sacredness, unless they are particularly studying those topics. But when I first saw Ashley Sack, the first thing I experienced was an intense feeling of shock and sadness and loss, disbelief. How could this happen? Even though I knew it had happened. The Sack does something through the way that it compels us to confront what we already know has taken place. So I felt all these things, and I immediately felt this is such a special artifact, such a special thing, that it really belongs in a category all its own. It's not like a document, and they can be compelling in and of themselves. And I then had to caution myself and remind myself that even though I was responding immediately and emotionally to this very powerful object, that I needed to put on my analytical hat, because that's my job. That's sort of what we promise to do as scholars, as academics, as historians. We promise, we have sort of a compact with our colleagues, with readers, with students, that we are going to put on our analytical hats, gather all the evidence we can, think hard about what it is that we find, and develop interpretations that are sound. So I had to caution myself and tell myself, yes, this feels like something in a different realm. It feels transcendent, it feels spiritual, but my job was to try to look at it from many different angles, to do the work of trying to take it apart and put it back together again to try to arrive at meanings. Now, once I had gone through that kind of personal reckoning, I realized that to be true to the artifact itself, I actually was going to have to come back around full circle to that space of emotion, because this is the centerpiece of the thing. Love is at the center of the embroidery, at the center of the textile, and I think at the center of these women's lives. And so in the end, after that long journey, I came back to wanting to give spirituality a place in the book, even if I couldn't understand it completely or describe it concretely, and to put love at the center of the book, which I think is where it belongs.
So there are chapters, and you talk, and I thought we'd just very briefly go over the three principal figures, and I've got a few quotes here, and you ask, what do we know about Rose? You say, not one record in the Martin family papers, I want you to maybe describe in a minute, the Martin family, describes Rose or the life she lived. Her cares, her kindnesses, fears, and frailties fade behind a wall of silence. Can we scale it? And then you say, we know at least this. Rose refused to submit to the lie that said she had no right to love her daughter. Instead, she claimed her child, sought to shield Ashley, and provided a priceless inheritance, which she folded into a sack. Rose's radical stance, obfuscated in the archives, reveals to us the potential force of human will against the odds. But maybe you can just tell us a kind of thumbnail sketch of the story of Rose and why Rose and Ashley were separated.
Well, the story of Rose is also the story of the search for Rose, as the section that you read just indicated, and as Kara Singleton's introductory remarks pointed to. Because we just don't have the records that we want, the records that we need to tell full and satisfying histories about enslaved peoples. because they were not their own record keepers for the most part. And they were not important in the eyes of those who did have the wherewithal to keep records and to maintain archives. And so one of the most important things to say about Rose, I think, is that we will never get as close to her as we might wish to. We will never be able to say concretely what she was thinking, how she was feeling, or even what she did, because the records don't exist to support that. The best piece of evidence that we have about Rose's life is on that sack, which to me is both frustrating and also beautiful. It's frustrating because it's not enough. It's beautiful because this sack was attained by Black women, hacked by Black women, passed down by Black women. I think we can assume that it was patched by Black women in that family. It was cared for Black women. It was tended. It was cared for by Black women. It was tended by Black women. And that is the kind of lineage for the thing itself that uplifts their experiences, it uplifts their voices, and forces us to look beyond archives. Archives are wonderful places. I was in one today, and it was actually a moment of feeling that the clouds had parted because I hadn't been able to travel and do research, since COVID. And yet, they're limited and they are flawed. And so what we do know about Rose is derived from the sack itself and from very limited archival records. The research on Rose was first done by an anthropologist named Mark Auslander. And he pieced together bits and pieces about her life, looking at the South Carolina records. I did the same independently and with the help of two genealogists who I was able to bring onto the project and to help me with this, Jesse Nelson and Hannah Scruggs. And what we found mirrored what Mark Auslander had found, which is very helpful because it gives us a greater sense of confidence that what we think we know about Rose and Ashley is probably what took place with regard to Rose and Ashley. And what the thumbnail sketch story is that Rose was a young woman enslaved by a man named Robert Martin in Charleston. Robert Martin was a wealthy man, but not a filthy rich man. He was somebody who was kind of striving to reach into the upper echelons of the South Carolina elites. And he did that partly by marrying his wife, Laveri Serena Martin, who was herself the daughter of a man who enslaved Black people and who had a cotton plantation in the western part of the state. And Robert Martin, he achieved in business. He was sort of a grocer at first, and he was kind of trading goods. And then he became a cotton factor. He was kind of an accountant. He handled richer people's money. And he really seems to have felt that he made it when he was able to acquire his own cotton plantation in the western part of the state of South Carolina. Around this same time, Robert Martin began acquiring and also was selling enslaved Black people, 1830s, 1840s. I speculate that Rose may have come into his hands in this same period because there are other records that show him, again, selling and acquiring other Black people. He actually acquired a number of enslaved Black people with the plantation that he bought in South Carolina. He sort of got people along with the real estate purchase. So Martin became really rich. He achieved this level of being a planter. He identified as a planter in the census, and then he died of a brain disease. This was in 1852. We know from the study of slavery in many locations that when a slaveholder, when an enslaver dies, all sorts of terrible things happen in the lives of the people they own. Because those people's lives, Black people's lives and Native people's lives, because sometimes we're talking about Native Americans who were enslaved, were attached to the lives of their enslavers. It was not uncommon for people to be separated from family, to be sold when their owners died. Robert Martin died, and soon thereafter, Ashley was sold. And I think it's also the case that soon thereafter, Rose died, although I can't say that for certain. Once Ashley is sold, we really don't have records about her. And if it were not for the sack, we might think that she hadn't made it. We might think that she hadn't survived. It's Ruth. It's Ruth being the carrier and the bearer of that story and having the commitment, the creativity to sew it down on the cloth, who lets us know that Ashley survived.
And you write how in the embroidery, she says that she is my grandmother, that Ashley is my grandmother. So you assume that Ashley was alive at the time that you can't know for sure, but you assume that she was alive during that moment.
That's right. I mean, so much of what I try to do in all that she carried is to draw out whatever might be present in those few sentences on the sack and then open them up into interpretation. And this is one of those moments that you just referred to, Tom. The sack says, Ashley is my grandmother. And to my mind, the use of the present tense suggests that Ashley and Ruth knew one another.
You write beautifully. I'll just read these two quotes about Ashley. So many African-American ancestors seem to vanish or at least fade from transparent view behind what genealogists sometimes call the wall of slavery. Ashley, at just 9 years old, must have been gathered up in the spoil of the mountain household transformation, after which her mother was lost to her. But what could this senseless existential break have meant for a real living child? It's nearly impossible for many of us to fathom. It skips a generation, and maybe you could tell us, we'll talk in a minute about Ruth, but Ruth had a mother, and you are able to discover some things about the generation between Ashley and Ruth. Maybe you can tell us what you've learned there.
Yes, so there is a gap in this history. There's more than one gap in this history. But one of them appears quite surprisingly in the later period. So there is a bit of information about Rose, a bit of information about Ashley. Ashley then seems to kind of fade. And then we have Ruth, the granddaughter. But of course, there is someone in between the granddaughter and the grandmother, and that person is the mother. I find it very interesting and kind of inconclusive that the mother is not mentioned on the sack itself. We don't know why it is that Ruth chose not to include her own mother in the story. Her own mother was most likely a woman named Rosa, because of the census records tell us. And this would make perfect sense because it is a tradition in African-American families. It certainly was a tradition in this period for people to name children and grandchildren after ancestors. It was another one of those ways of maintaining lines of familial connection, of recognizing kin, even when the slavery system attempted to bury those very important connections. And so Rosa was born and grew up and lived her life out in the interior of South Carolina, working as a domestic, which was the typical occupation for most Black women in the late 19th and early 20th century.
And then you talk about the significance of Ruth's decision to capture the story through embroidery. That you write that she could have written it down on paper and pen and paper, but she chose embroidery. And we have our first question from the audience that it looks almost like a poem and the manner in which it's written. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your thoughts about the importance of embroidery and then how the poem is actually laid out on the sack, or how the words are laid out on the sack.
Yes, I agree with the person who asked that question. Just sit long enough with that embroidery and you begin to see so many other forms in it. I think that it does look like a poem. It feels like a poem, that reads like a poem. It has some of the elements of the haiku form. Sometimes I think of it as being like a recipe, like a list of the things that one needs to make something, in this case, to make life. It is, of course, a story. And it also has the look and the feel of a document. So it is the case that embroiderers, who were typically girls, young women of the middle classes, often white, but some African American girls and women did also embroider, did sign their names and sign a date at the bottom of some of their handiwork. So that's not unusual for a piece of embroidery. At the same time, put this embroidered text next to a written document, which is also going to have a name and a date, and the format looks very similar. And so these kinds of connections, these kinds of associations, just make me think about, my goodness, how creative, how brilliant, how innovative this Ruth Middleton must have been to layer this single record of her family story with all of these different suggestions of various forms. To your question about embroidery, Tom, I sat with this for a while. I found it curious and interesting. I found it challenging because I am much more accustomed to working with written texts, and especially narratives written by Black women who had been enslaved and who had managed to escape and either wrote their stories down themselves or told their stories to someone else who wrote the stories down. So I, of course, wondered, why would Ruth embroider this? It seems like it would be easier, more straightforward, more in keeping with the norm to write it down. And maybe she did. While I was doing the research and writing, it occurred to me, I can't assume she didn't write it down just because we don't have that piece of paper. Perhaps she wrote it down for her own purposes, to save for her own family. Perhaps she wrote it down as a way of sketching out what it was that she would do on the embroidery. But nevertheless, she did take another step. She took the step of sewing the story, which, as I began to think about it and do more reading on embroidery, really seemed to indicate that Ruth was making a bid for her own status, for her own dignity, and for the status and dignity of the women who came before her in her family line. Because while a minority of African American women did learn fancy needlework, for the most part, that kind of needlework was reserved for white women. First, for elites, and then for the middle classes. So for Ruth, who was herself a domestic, who came from a long line of Black women who had been domestics, whether forced through chattel slavery or chosen within the very limited set of occupational options that Black women had, she chose to set herself apart from that kind of labor and to associate herself with a middle-class style of respectability, femininity, adornment. And I think I ended up thinking, and I think, to this moment, that this is a political aspect that's kind of tucked into Rose's embroidery. That she is saying, I am here, I can do this, I deserve to be viewed with all of the respect and, frankly, all of the adoration with which white women are viewed during her time and in her society.
That prompts me to ask, her proactive stance there. You write that this particular piece of African American women's material culture has a certain vibrancy to it, and you say it hails out to us and encourages us to take some action. Tell us what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm. Well, this part of the book, where I'm thinking about the sack as a thing, is influenced by two different inputs. One of those inputs is how I felt going back to that original moment that you asked me about, Tom, at the start of our conversation, how I felt when I saw the sack. I felt like I was taking in and in fact being drawn into something that was not just a sterile, inanimate object, but instead something that had its own vibrancy or life. The sack really did seem to call me toward it. And I think a number of people have that experience. Certainly, the sack was able to elicit a strong emotion for me, actually, an emotional mix for me. And I think many people experience that as well. Ordinary basic things don't tend to have that impact. I've got a pen right next to me. It doesn't have any kind of impact on me in that way. It just sits here doing nothing. The sack seems to be, it seems to exist. It seems to have a sense of life around it. And here we get into that space of the sacred, right? The space of the spiritual, the emotional. That's a little risky to touch when we're talking about academics, work. But I think this is the love. I think this is the love that Rose packs into the sack that we still feel and that we know is there because the sack embroidery tells us. So that's one input. The other input is that there is an academic conversation around objects and things and around stating that there's a difference between those two terms. I'm using them interchangeably because it's just more efficient. But this area of thought says there's a difference between those two terms. It suggests that an object may be kind of static, doing not much in the world until we do something with it, but that a thing may have more energy, more of an ability to act on us as human beings. And so that whole set of thinking influenced me as well and helped me to try to articulate how this is and why this is not just an ordinary thing.
One of our questioners is asking, have you located any descendants, any living descendants of Ruth Middleton?
I have not located any descendants, and I have tried, and the genealogist that I mentioned who are working with me, they tried. In my previous projects, I have sometimes been able to identify descendants in advance and sometimes not been able to. But I don't think there's been one thing that I have published that has been out there for a handful of months that has not actually encouraged people to contact me and say, I'm a descendant. And it's really exciting when that happens. So I'm hoping that if there are descendants out there, that they might be willing to let me know. I would love to have a conversation with them.
Early on speaking of kind of contemporary times, early on in the book, you recount a story that your grandmother told you of your great aunt, Margaret, and how it also connects to a piece of material culture in your family. I thought maybe you could tell us briefly that story.
Sure. One of the things that seems so special about Ashley's sack is that people who see it and interact with it often describe being called into a greater or more intense space of their own memories of loved ones. So I've had people, for instance, mention that seeing the sack reminds them of their own lost children, for example. I know it's very sad. It's very sad. And let me just say as an aside that I think when the sack does that, it brings forward, it brings to the fore those very difficult, painful memories. But I think it also offers a sense of catharsis for people who read the story of the sack and think about how how unyielding grief seems to be, and then see that Ashley survived despite it. So I think the SAG has that effect on people of bringing people into a greater awareness of their family connections and family stories and loves and losses. And it was the same for me. I am the very fortunate keeper of a family quilt, which was quilted by my great aunt Margaret, somebody who I never met, but who I heard about through story. And the story was told by my grandmother, whose name was Alice. And she told this story many times over the course of my childhood. And I'm sure she's told this story as well to my cousins. My grandmother was a real storyteller, and she was such a pro. And the story she told was of what it was like for her growing up in rural Mississippi with her parents and her several siblings, and how at first, as a child, life seemed good. They had plenty to eat. I remember her saying that was very important, having plenty to eat, because they wouldn't always. They would go hungry later on. They had plenty to eat. They had a porch. They had lots of cows. They had land, and they were doing well. But they lost their land when some white men in town came and basically tricked or pushed or threatened her father into signing away the land with his X mark, because he could not read or write. And after that moment, they were thrown into poverty. They had nothing. They became sharecroppers, and they had to basically crawl their way back up to any kind of subsistence living. My grandmother ended up deciding that the North would be better for her. And I can't help but think about the decision that Ruth Middleton made. So my grandmother went north and moved to Ohio, and kept thinking back always to that moment in Mississippi. It was sort of a recurring story for her that she told many, many times. And the hero of the story, as she told it, was that great aunt Margaret who I never met, because even though the family was cheated, defrauded, tricked into having to give up their land and their livestock and their things, Margaret, who was just a teenager herself, saw what was happening and ran out the back door, got one of their cows, and walked it over to their neighbor's house. And she saved that one cow, which was incredible. And my grandmother talks about how they would have been lost if it hadn't been for that one cow that her big sister Margaret saved. And so whenever I look at my quilt that I'm so fortunate to have, I think about my great aunt Margaret, who I never met. I think about my grandmother, and I think about that story of resilience.
My quoting, it's slightly repetitive, but you write, I had never met this dauntless aunt. I had never even glimpsed a picture of her, but I had seen and touched and admired the work of her hands, a connection just as powerful. This fabric and the tale I associated with had blanketed and anchored me, a reminder of dignity preserved and of the hope in our dire times that something necessary for preservation and elevation of life might in the end be saved. Lovely. We're getting close to the end of our time, and when I asked you a question earlier about the SAC and it's kind of calling us out to action, I thought you might talk a little bit more about it. Let me just give another quote and have you comment on it. The SAC carries a burden of layered power relations, but it also contains within its preservation history a model for repurposing the past and for regenerating relationships as we engage in work of shared purpose across racial and regional lines. There are a number of times in the book that I found quite inspiring in this kind of notion of thinking of the challenges that others faced in their times, giving me a bit more, courage to perhaps face the challenges of our own. But maybe, I don't know if I read that into it or if that was your intent, but perhaps you could comment on that.
Well, that's certainly one of the most important things that I see in this story. I started working on this project in 2016, which was quite a momentous year in our nation's history and actually in world history, given what followed. And we had already been divided in many ways along the lines of political affiliation. But things became much more intense, much more vitriolic since 2016. And it seems as if they're only getting worse. This project actually helped me to feel a sense of optimism, even in the midst of all of this internal strife and division, because Rose and Ashley faced a separation that would last their entire lives, a separation that was insurmountable, a separation that would leave its mark on them and their descendants forever. But they managed to bridge it. They managed to maintain their connection through love. That's what seems to be the thing in the sack that would have enabled Ashley to know her worth and to stay connected to her mother, Rose. And the same for Ruth, staying connected to her foremothers. I hesitate in saying this because I feel that sometimes we overuse these words that seem saccharine, but I actually take heart in realizing at times like this that I am actually just going back to the source of that sack, which is emphasizing love. And I think love is the answer we have. It's the answer that that Rose's actions and that Ruth's embroidery offer for us around how it is we might navigate not only emergency and crisis, but also extreme separation.
I'm going to close with a couple more quotes from the book, but before I do, any other parting words? Those were lovely ones to end on, but or anything I didn't ask that you might have wanted to share with our audience?
Yes, I do have a few thoughts that I'd like to add here at the end. There's a line in the book that I have heard people repeat back to me in some events, and so I want to share it here because it seems to be meaningful to people. And it's the line that says, we are our descendants' ancestors. I think that's so important because it underscores the fact that we have to act the way that Rose acted to care for the ones who come after us. It's our duty.
Suppose it's not a surprise that that's the quote that I chose. So let me put it in a little bit of context to maybe end this wonderful session. Your words, actually 3 short quotes. First, I was struck by this, a quiet assertion of the right to life, liberty, and beauty, even for those at the bottom. The sack stands in eloquent defense of our country's ideals by indicting its failures. Can we commit our imaginations like Rose, Ashley, and Ruth once did to packing the sacks, carrying the seeds, and stitching the story cloth of tomorrow? Just as Rose and Ashley found on their forced journeys through slavery's landscape, there is no safe place of escape left for us. The walls of the world are closing in. We need to get out of here in a hurry. We need to get out of these frames of mind and states of emotion that elevate mastery over compassion, division over connection, and greed over care, separating us one from another and locking us in. Our only option in this predicament, the state of political and planetary emergency, are to act as first responders or die not trying. We are the ancestors of our descendants. They are the generations we've made. With a radical hope for their survival, what will we pack into their sacks? Tiya Miles, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And again, thank you for this very, very moving book and story that you relayed so beautifully.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me.